بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا ما يهده الله فلا مضل له وما يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله ما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. Today we start the 7th lesson, and we commence with the statement of Imam AT-tahaawiyyah rahimahullah, حي لا يموت قيوم لا ينام. And in fact, these two statements of Imam AT-tahaawiyyah rahimahullah follow on from the previous statement that we finished off with in the last lesson, when he said, وَلَا يُشْبِهُ الْأَنَامِ وَلَا يُشْبِهُ الْأَنَامِ, that the creation, that he does not resemble any of the creation. And so after this statement, Imam AT-tahaawiyyah, he mentions 6 more statements which are an explanation of this statement, right? Meaning that Allah does not resemble any of the creation. So then he mentions 6 other statements, and of those 6 I've mentioned 2. Hayyun la yamut, that he is ever living who never dies. Qayyumun la yanam, that he is the self-sustaining who never sleeps. Khaliqun bila haja, that he is the creator without a need, without any need. Raziqun bila mu'nah, that he is the provider without any store of any provision. I mean, he doesn't need to have any stores of provision for himself. Mumitun bila makhafa, and the one who takes life without any fear of anyone. And the one who resurrects, ba'ithun bila mashaqqa, and the one who resurrects without any effort or difficulty, without any difficulty. So these are 6 statements. And we see that there's a particular purpose behind Imam AT-tahaawiyyah mentioning these 6 statements, and they are to explain, as I said, the statement that came before, وَلَا يُشْبِهُ الْأَنَامِ, that he does not resemble any of the creation. And so from these 6 statements, what we want to do inshallah ta'ala in today's lesson is focus on the first 2. حَيٌّ لَا يَمُوتُ قَيُّومٌ لَا يَنَامُ, that he is ever living who never dies, and the one who is self-sustaining, qayyum, who never sleeps. So regarding this, Shaykh Salih al-Fawzan, he says, regarding hayyun la yamut, that Allah is ever living, he never dies. Shaykh Salih al-Fawzan, he says that Allah's life is a complete life, a perfect life, in which there is no kind of deficiency, and there is no sleep. Allah says, Allahu la ilaha illahu al-hayyul qayyum la ta'khudhuhu sinatun wa la nawm. This is the beginning of Ayatul Kursi. That Allah, there is none which has a right to be worshipped except He. Al-hayy, meaning the ever-living. Al-qayyum, the self-sustaining, and the one who sustains everything besides Him. Neither sleep nor slumber overtakes Him. And likewise, the Shaykh mentions another ayah, وَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى الْحَيِّ الَّذِي لَا يَمُوتُ, that place your trust and reliance upon the ever-living who never dies. So we see here that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He denied from Himself a sinah. A sinah is a light type of sleep, and a nawm. A nawm is the proper sleep which overwhelms you and makes you unconscious, whereas a sinah is a light type of sleep. So Allah has negated from Himself both these things. Neither sleep nor slumber. Neither slumber nor sleep overtakes Him. And so here we see, in essence, Allah has negated from Himself death. And sleeping and tiredness and weariness and so on and so forth. And death is actually a deficiency in relation to life. Death is a deficiency in relation to life. So Allah is free of death and anything which approaches or is like that, like sleep and so on and so forth. But we see, as it relates to the creation, for the creation, their life is deficient because they sleep and they become weary, and also they die. So their life is unlike Allah's life, which is free of all of these aspects. As for the creation, then sleeping is a perfection for the creation. And for Allah it is a defect, and it is denied for Allah. But for the creation to sleep, to actually sleep, is from His perfection. It is something that He requires to be healthy and sound and so on and so forth. So when He sleeps, then it adds to His health and perfection and so on and so forth. But as for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it is a deficiency. Because as the Shaykh explains, anyone who doesn't sleep from the creation, then his health will be compromised, he will be weak, he will be ill. And so this indicates the difference between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His creation. So these two names, Al-Hayy, Al-Qayyum, they are taken from the statement of Allah in Ayatul Kursi, as we mentioned, Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-Hayyul Qayyum. There is none which has the right to be worshipped except Allah. And He is Al-Hayy, Al-Qayyum. As for the meaning of Al-Qayyum, so this is the meaning of Al-Hayy. Al-Hayy is the ever-living, who never dies, and neither sleep nor slumber or anything like that which is a deficiency in the perfection of life. Allah is free from all of that. And as for Al-Qayyum, the meaning of Al-Qayyum is the one who is established by himself, Al-Qa'imu binafsihi, and the one who establishes everyone besides him, Wal-Muqimu lighayrihi. The one who is self-established, he is established on his own, and he is the one who establishes, meaning that he gives everything besides him its existence. Everything besides him, he maintains it. He provides it. Its existence is there, and it is present because Allah is maintaining and sustaining it. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we see from this that what this name essentially means is that Allah is not in need of anything. Allah is not in need of anything. Allah is not in need of anything at all. He is free of need from every single thing besides Himself. And He is the one who establishes everything besides Himself. And everything is needy of Him. Everything is faqir, is needy, is in want of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not establish the heavens and the earth and all the created beings, then they would have all perished and would have expired and been destroyed. But Allah is the one who is Al-Qayyum, meaning He maintains them, He preserves them, and He gives them an extension. He allows them to exist. And, so this is the meaning of Al-Qayyum. And so we see that everything from the creation is in need of Him. And the Shaykh mentions an ayah, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُمْسِكُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ أَن تَزُولَ وَلَئِنْ زَالَتَا إِنْ أَمْسَكَهُمَا مِنْ أَحَدٍ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ. That Allah is the one who holds or who maintains the heavens and the earth from that they should perish or from that they should end. And if they were to end, then who is there after Him to hold them, meaning to maintain them? Who is there after Him who would maintain them if they were to end? So this is the brief explanation of Shaykh Salih Al-Fawzan, Hafidhullah. He's basically just given us an idea of the meanings of these two names that At-Tahaawi has mentioned. And so we move on to Shaykh Salih Al-Shaykh, and so he explains Hayyun la yamut, Qayyumun la yanam, that Allah is the ever-living who never dies, the self-sustaining who never sleeps, Khaliqun bila haja, the one who creates without any need, Raziqun bila ma'unah, the one who provides without any store of provision. So the Shaykh says, explaining this, he says, we see that these are certain qualities and attributes that At-Tahaawi has now mentioned. And that these six, there are actually six in total, we're only focusing on the first two. But these six, we see that they all represent attributes of the Creator. So when At-Tahaawi says, Hayyun la yamut, he is indicating the attribute of life, hayat. And when he says, Qayyuman la yanam, he's indicating the attribute of qayyumiyyah, meaning this self-sustainingness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And likewise, when he says khaliqun bila haja, that Allah is the creator, he's indicating the attribute of khalq, that Allah creates. And likewise, raziqun bila ma'una, he's indicating the attribute of rizq, that from Allah's attribute is that He provides rizq. And likewise he says mumit mumitun bila makhafa, that He is the one who takes life without having any fear of anyone. He takes life without having any fear of anyone. And ba'ithun bila mashaqqa, and He's the one who resurrects without having any difficulty or weariness therein. So these 6 attributes, the Shaykh explains that, or he will explain, that the reason why At-Tahaawi mentions them is to make a distinction between these attributes which are also found in the creation, because in the creation you have life, you have beings who are self-sustaining, you have likewise you have, we create things, we can create things, we can make things. Likewise we can provide provision for others. Likewise we can even take life. So these qualities are found in the creation. But we see that At-Tahaawi here, when he mentioned before that Allah does not resemble the creation, if you remember the statement before, وَلَا يُشْبِهُ الْأَنَامِ, here he's mentioned these 6 qualities. And in each of these 6 qualities, he's mentioning a difference. His intent is to point out a difference. So he says, Hayyun la yamut. Allah is ever living, but He doesn't die. So now there's a difference between Allah and the creation, even though they both have the attribute of life. And likewise, Qayyumun la yanam, that He is self-sustaining, but He never sleeps. A man, he can be self-sustaining, meaning he can eat himself, he can work himself, he can stand himself, he can do all these things himself. He's not in need of anything besides him. He's qayyum in that sense, or he's qa'imu bi nafsihi in that sense. He is qa'imun bi nafsihi in that sense. And so the difference between him and his Lord is that Allah never sleeps, Allah never dies. And likewise, khaliqun bila haja. Allah creates, but when He creates, does He have a need for what He's created? No, He doesn't. But mankind, when he creates, a man creates a tool, a man creates machinery, a man creates other things. Why does he create them? He creates them because he needs them. His life depends upon them. He wants them. He needs them. That is the difference. And likewise, when we say razikun bila ma'una, right? So the same principle applies to all of these things, or most of these things that At-Tahaawi has mentioned here. So the Shaykh, he then goes on to explain that the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are different to the attributes of the creation from a number of different angles. And he mentions 3 of them here. The first angle is that Allah, whenever He is described with any attribute, then He is described with that attribute from the aspect of complete perfection. Complete perfection. And as for the creatures, the creation, then when they are described with any attribute, then they are described with it from the angle of deficiency. Right? So Allah is described with life, the creation is described with life. Allah's life is complete perfection in every single respect. The life of mankind, the life of the creatures, it's a deficient type of life, because they die, they sleep, and the same is said about all of the other attributes which are common, or where there is a shared meaning between Allah and His creation. So first of all, this is the difference, that when the creation is described with any attribute, it is an attribute which is deficient in some respect or another. And when Allah is described with an attribute, it is complete and utter perfection, the utmost perfection, without any deficiency approaching it whatsoever. That's the first one. The second difference between Allah and His creatures in terms of the attributes is that Allah's attributes are what we call mutalazima. What this means essentially is that every single one of Allah's attributes and whatever other attributes follow on from them, all of them together are actually perfection. They're complete perfection. So Allah is never described with attributes of perfection and attributes of deficiency. Rather, all of Allah's attributes and whatever other attributes follow on from them, they are all complete perfection. Whereas we see in the creation that a man might be, for example, he might be just, he might be kind, he might be merciful, but at the same time he might be niggardly, he might be greedy, he might be stingy. So, for mankind, the attributes are not such that the perfection in one implies the perfection in the others. Right? In other attributes. This is not the case for mankind. For mankind, you can have some attributes which are, which are good, and some other attributes in which he is deficient. Whereas for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we see that every single one of His attributes, all of them are perfection. The perfection in one necessitates and is tied to the perfection in another, and so on and so forth. We see that this is not found in the creation. That's why we see good qualities in some people. We see them having some excellent qualities. As I said, someone might be just, he might be kind, then he might have deficiencies in other respects. So that's the second difference between Allah and His creatures in terms of the attributes. And the third difference is that when Allah is described with any attribute, and when the creation are described with attributes, then even though the meanings are the same underneath, then Allah is described by those attributes not from the angle that He is in need of what follows on from them. This is similar to what I explained before, and the best way to explain this is by way of an example that we mentioned, that when a man he creates something. A man, as I said, he creates maybe a mill to grind, seeds or weeds to make flour, or a man makes any type of machinery, or he makes any kind of, gadget or whatever else it is. Why does he make that thing? He makes it because he is in need of it. His life is facilitated by way of it. He needs it, and so when we see an attribute which is common between Allah and His creation, then we see man is in fact in need of that attribute, or is in need from that thing. So why does man create? Why does he have khalq? Because he needs to create things. He needs to facilitate his life. When Allah creates, does He need His creation? Does He need anything from His creation? Allah doesn't need any of that. So that is the difference. And so the point the Shaykh is mentioning here then is that when we see there are common attributes between Allah and His creation, Allah is described with life, man is described with life, Allah is described with creating, man is described with creating, even though He doesn't create from nothing, but He creates other things from material already present. Likewise, man, he sees, he hears. So all of these are common between Allah and the creation. And so with respect to the example that we gave, why does a man create? Because he needs, those things. As for Allah, then the issue is not like that. And so this is why the Shaykh says that when we look at all of these statements, these 6 statements, even for example, when a person when someone kills somebody else, he takes the life of somebody else. Why does he do that? He does it maybe out of fear, or he does it some other type of motive. But as for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we see that Imam At-Tahaawi said, Mumitun bila makhafa, that He takes life without any fear, without having any fear. So when Allah takes life, it is not like when a human takes another life. It is completely different. So we see that in all of these respects, Imam At-Tahaawi is making the distinction between the creator and the created. And through what he's mentioned, we see that some of these principles are made clear, right? In terms of what, the intent behind At-Tahaawi's words, we see that these principles are made clear from this speech and from these statements. Okay. Then, this was the first issue. The second issue is that when we look at the statement of Imam At-Tahaawi, we see that he makes an affirmation and a negation, right? So he says Hayyun, affirming for Allah that Allah is ever living. Then he says La Yamut, He does not die. Then he makes a negation, and then he says Qayyumun La Yanam, that He is self-sustaining, who never sleeps. So what do we see here? We see an affirmation and a negation. Now, we have a principle with Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah which you have to pay attention to, which is that whenever we make a negation from Allah, we are not negating from Allah just for the sake of negating in and of itself, but rather there is a purpose behind making any type of negation from Allah. And that purpose is to indicate the perfection in its opposite. Okay? So in other words, here, when we say Hayyun la yamut, Allah is ever living, why are we saying la yamut? Why are we saying he never dies? We are saying la yamut because we want to make sure that the completion and the perfection in the meaning of life is understood and known. Otherwise, we could say Allah is living, man is living. But we haven't singled out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of the perfection in the meaning of life or in life itself. Right? So here, the principle is then that whenever we make any type of negation from Allah, whenever we say Allah is not this, Allah is not that, obviously we do that on the basis of a text first and foremost, but there's a reason behind it, and which is to indicate the complete opposite and the perfection of whatever is its opposite. And we see examples of this in the Quran, and this obviously is one of them. We see Allah says, Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayyul qayyum. Ayatul Kursi again. So he begins, and we see the affirmation that Allah is al-hayy and al-qayyum. But straight afterwards, what does Allah say? Allah says, La ta'khudhuhu sinatun wala nawm. That neither slumber nor sleep overtake him. So we see here an affirmation and then a negation. But why is the negation made? Is this negation just, when we speak about Allah, do we just say, Allah never sleeps, Allah never dies? What is the intent behind this negation? The negation isn't a negation made in and of itself. This is why we don't say, when we describe Allah, we don't speak about or with these negations by themselves. We don't say, Allah doesn't sleep, Allah doesn't die, Allah is not unjust, Allah is not stingy. We don't speak like that. Because the intent isn't just to make the negations in and of themselves. Rather, we see that in the Quran and the Sunnah, the intent behind them is to indicate the complete perfection of Allah in an attribute that we affirm. Okay, so we need to be clear about this, that this is a principle that we have, that we have as Ahlul Sunnah. And this is different between ourselves and the people of Kalam, Ilm al-Kalam, as we say, that these people from their way is to make negations in and of themselves. Right? To say Allah is not a body, He is not an incidental attribute, an arad, He's not above, He's not below, He's not inside the universe, not outside the universe, He's not in a location, He's not in a place, He's not this, He's not that, He's not this, He's not this. And when they make these negations, they make these negations in and of themselves, and they are standalone negations. As we said, this is not the way from Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah. So the point being here then, when we see in the Quran, we'll give you another example. Allah says, وَلَا يَظْلِمُ رَبُّكَ أَحَدًا. Allah says, and your Lord is not unjust to anybody. He's never unjust to anybody. Allah has negated from Himself oppression. But what is the purpose of negating this oppression? It is to indicate Allah's complete and perfect justice, His adl and His hikmah. Okay? So this is how we as Ahlul Sunnah, how we see this issue of negating from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is not something that we seek in and of itself, rather it is something which is done in order to affirm the completion and perfection in Allah's names and His attributes. Likewise, another example, Allah says, وَمَا كَانَ رَبُّكَ نَسِيًّا. That your Lord is never one who forgets. Right? This negation is not made in and of itself, but it is to indicate the perfection in Allah's hifz, in His preserving, and in His qayyumiyyah, meaning in the fact that He maintains everything besides Himself. And the perfection in Allah's knowledge. This is what it indicates. And likewise, Allah says, لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. He negated three things from Himself. He is neither born, nor He did not give birth, nor is anything given birth, and there is nothing which is a likeness unto Him. Nothing which is a likeness unto Him. So we see here that the purpose behind all of this is to indicate Allah is Al-Ahad, As-Samad, which He mentioned at the beginning of the surah, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ Allahu Samad. Right? To show that Allah is one, He is alone, and He is self-sustaining, not in need of anything. And so from this is that that there is nothing which is like Him or equal to Him, He doesn't have any offspring, and so on and so forth. So this then is an important principle which distinguishes Ahlul Sunnah from the people of innovation, which is that when we negate anything from Allah, then it is, in order to indicate the perfection, the opposite, the perfection in the opposite of that thing. The third point that the Shaykh moves on to and mentions is that these two names, Al-Qayyum, Al-Hayy and Al-Qayyum, we see that they are tied to His creation, in the sense that everything you see taking place in the creation of life, of any action, of any activity, meaning everything in the creation that takes place, then all of it is tied to these two names. Right? So everything in the creation taking place refers back to these two names, Al-Hayy and Al-Qayyum. And as we shall see shortly, inshallah ta'ala, we see that these two names themselves, from them, branch off all of the names of Allah which are tied to His rububiyyah. Right? All of the other names of Allah which are tied to His rububiyyah, they come and they are tied to these two names, Al-Hayy and Al-Qayyum. So anyway, here we see that these two names are connected to everything which takes place in the creation. And when a person understands this, he then realizes the importance of making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how Allah responds to a person when a person calls upon Allah by way of these names. Now we see Allah says, وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا وَذَرُوا الَّذِينَ يُلْحِدُونَ فِي أَسْمَائِهِ. That to Allah belong the most beautiful names, so call upon Him by way of them, and leave those who deviate with respect to His names. And so the point being here that this is from the fiqh of dua, from the understanding, a person understanding the subject of dua, in the sense that when he knows that Al-Hayy and Al-Qayyum are tied to everything that takes place in the creation, and that Al-Hayy and Al-Qayyum are the two names to which all of the other names of Allah which are tied to these two names, like Al-Khaliq. When we say Al-Hayy and Al-Qayyum, from that follows on Al-Khaliq, right? Because it is from His rububiyyah. Likewise, Al-Razzaq, the provider, that is tied to His rububiyyah. Al-Mumit, Al-Muhyi, the one who takes life, the one who gives life, it is tied to Allah's rububiyyah. And so on and so forth, to all of the other names which are tied to Allah's rububiyyah. There are very many. All of them, they come back to these two names, Al-Hayy, Al-Qayyum. And this really shows you as well why Ayatul Kursi is the greatest verse in the Quran. Why it's the greatest verse in the Quran. You look at the first, in fact we'll mention this in a short while as well. But if you look at this verse, and we see that at the beginning of this verse we see Allahu la ilaha illa huwal hayyul qayyum. We see first of all Allah mentioning uluhiyya, Allahu la ilaha illahu. This is Tawheed al-Uluhiyya. Then we see Allah mentioning Al-Hayy Al-Qayyum. These are two names from which every other name tied to Rububiyyah is linked to. So we have Rububiyyah. Then we also have Al-Asma'i was-Sifat. Al-Hayy Al-Qayyum. Al-Hayy, which is Allah's Hayat, and Al-Qayyum, which is Allah's Qayyumiyyah. And from Al-Hayy, when something is living, from that come other attributes like hearing and seeing and will and knowledge and so on and so forth. So we see Al-Asma'i was-Sifat in here as well. So this passage, Allahu la ilaha illa huwal hayyul qayyum, we now understand from this why this ayah, Ayatul Kursi, is from the greatest of the verses in the Quran. And why? Because it contains Tawheed al-Uluhiyya, Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, Tawheed al-Asma'i was-Sifat. And this is why there is an issue that the scholars discuss, which is what is the greatest name of Allah, which if He is called upon, then He will most certainly respond. And this is on the basis of a hadith in which a man, he made a supplication And in this supplication, he actually mentioned these two names, that La ilaha illallah, that by Allah, besides whom there is none which has a right to be worshipped, Allahu la ilaha illahu al-hayyul qayyum. Basically in that supplication we see the same thing repeated as we find in the beginning of Ayatul Kursi. And then the messenger, when he was listening to this man making the supplication, he said that this man has made a supplication by way of by the name of Allah, which if a person was to ask him by, that he would definitely be answered. And so the scholars discuss an issue which is, which is the greatest name of Allah. And so they mention these two, that these two, when you say Al-Hayy Al-Qayyum, these are from the greatest names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that whenever someone asks Allah by way of them, He will certainly be responded to. And this is because it also shows you, as we said, that this is from the fiqh of dua. From the fiqh of dua, because a person understands the connection of these two names to everything in the creation, to everything which Allah has created. Because everything in the creation arises from and emanates from and is tied to these two names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That Allah is Al-Hayy and that Allah is Al-Qayyum, and they indicate His complete and perfect rububiyyah. So therefore, when a person is making dua, then he makes dua based upon the appropriate names. And what are the most appropriate names, the best names? Al-Hayy, Al-Qayyum. Then the fourth issue, which we finish with inshallah ta'ala, the fourth issue that the Shaykh mentions is that both of these two names, Al-Hayy and Al-Qayyum, they indicate all of the other attributes, as we just mentioned. So when we speak about Allah's life, then Allah's life is something which indicates His knowledge and His will and His ability, power, and so on and so forth. And for this reason, there's a connected issue here, that the scholars, when they speak about some of the people of innovation, they speak about the Ash'aris, they speak about the Maturidis, and these people, they claim that their reason proves 7 attributes. Well, they say Allah, through reason alone, we know that Allah exists, and we know that Allah has life. If He has life, we know therefore that He must have a hearing, seeing, and will, and be able to speak. And we must therefore know also that He has a will, and that He has power, and that He has speech, and so on and so forth. So the reason in this manner. So what the scholars say is that they criticize them when they say that if you have used reason in order to deduce these attributes as you claim, then you are deficient, because reason also proves many other attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because reason can also prove that Allah is merciful. Allah has rahmah. The fact that we see the rain and we see mercy amongst the creation, we see many things that point to Allah's mercy, then this in itself points to Allah's attribute of mercy. Likewise, Allah's attribute of al-hikmah, Allah's wisdom. Likewise, Allah's attribute of anger, and so on and so forth. Right? So, the point being here that when we look at Allah's attribute of Al-Hayy and Al-Qayyum, from them there are also indicated many other attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. More than what just those people of innovation, the Ash'aris, what they claim that reason proves them. Right? Because reason proves more than what they claim. So in other words, they are using reason, but even in their use of reason, it is defective and deficient and contradictory. As Ibn al-Qayyim explains in one of his works, that reason proves many other attributes besides these that we mentioned. And he goes on to explain. He says, when we look at, for example, the rain coming down and the herbage and the food and everything else, this is from Allah's mercy. And when we see people being punished and we see calamities and so on, well, this indicates Allah's ghadab, and Allah's anger. And when we see Allah ennobling the believers and honouring them, and and so on and so forth, then we see this is a sign of Allah's pleasure, ar-rida, and so on. So then he continues to give examples of other types of attributes: Allah's hikmah, Allah's mercy. Those attributes that the innovators don't accept. So the point being here that these two names, Al-Hayy and Al-Qayyum, just like they indicate all of the names of Allah which are from His rububiyyah, like Al-Khaliq, Al-Razzaq, and so on and so forth, Al-Muhyi, Al-Mumit, and so on and so forth, then likewise they also indicate many of Allah's attributes. They indicate many of Allah's attributes, like we mentioned, some of those that we just mentioned. And so in this point, there is a refutation of the people of bid'ah, like the Ash'aris and the Maturidis, who claim that through reason alone we only establish 7 attributes for Allah, and as for all of the rest, then we negate them for Allah. This is wrong, and this is wrong because these 2 names of Allah, Al-Hayy, Al-Qayyum, in themselves point to many of these other attributes just through reason alone. Even though we find them also in the Quran, established in the Quran, and that is the basis why we speak of them. So the Shaykh then finishes by saying that this statement here then, Al-Qayyum, just like Al-Hayy, it necessitates many of the other attributes, and so he finishes on this note. And so inshallah ta'ala, we will probably finish the lesson on this note and continue with the remaining 4 statements inshallah ta'ala in the next lesson. So as we said, just to summarize then, that At-Tahaawi, he said, وَلَا يُشْبِهُ الْأَنَامِ, that he does not resemble the creation. Alright, this is where we finished in the previous lesson. And after that statement, he then mentioned 6 other qualities of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these 6 qualities are life, perfect life, without any death. Allah does not die. That Allah is Qayyum, the self-sustaining, He never sleeps. That Allah is Khaliq, He is the creator without any need. That Allah is Raziq, the provider without having any need for any stores of provision. And that Allah is Mumit, the one who takes life without fearing anybody. And that Allah is Ba'ith bila mashaqqa, the one who resurrects without having any hardship or difficulty in that regard. So all of these 6 statements are an explanation of that one statement, that Allah does not resemble His creatures. And we see that in all of these qualities that were mentioned, life, and likewise being self-sustaining, and likewise creating and providing, we see that these are attributes which are common between mankind and the Creator. Allah has life, man has life. Man creates, Allah also creates, even though man creates from material that already exists. Man, he provides, a man provides for his family. A man can, he can farm, he can till, he can make provision. And likewise, a man can even kill somebody else. But why does he kill somebody else? Why does he take somebody else's life? Maybe it's for fear, maybe it's for some need, maybe it's for some whatever, maybe it's oppression, whatever else it might be. In all of these respects, in all of these things that have been mentioned about Allah in these statements, then At-Tahaawi has distinguished between that which is for Allah, which is complete perfection, and that which is for man, which has deficiency. Right? This is how we understand these 6 statements. And so, on a final note then, we've probably been through maybe about 12, 13 statements now of At-Tahaawi. And one of the things that you should realize, and one of the things that you should understand, especially when you go through these explanations, you see that there's a structure. There's actually a structure in the statements of At-Tahaawi in this particular example. We see, first of all, in the first 4 statements, we see him explaining Tawheed. If you remember, he said, نَقُولُ فِي تَوْحِيدِ اللَّهِ, we say about the Tawheed of Allah, مُعْتَقِدِينَ بِتَوْفِيقِ اللَّهِ, that we believe with Allah's success that Allah is one. إِنَّ اللَّهَ وَاحِدٌ لَا شَرِيكَ لَهُ. Allah is one, and He does not have any partner. Okay, so he began with the statement of Tawheed. Then in the next 3 statements, he went on to clarify each of those. The next 3 statements explain that first one. Right? They are an explanation of Tawheed itself. So he said, وَلَا شَيْءَ مِثْلُهُ, there is nothing which is like Him. Then he said, وَلَا شَيْءَ يُعْجِزُهُ, there is nothing which can make Him, which makes Him incapable. So we see al-asma'i wa sifat, and then al-rububiyyah, and then he said, وَلَا إِلَهَ غَيْرَهُ, and there is nothing which has a right to be worshipped besides him. وَلَا إِلَهَ غَيْرُهُ. And then after this, he said, قَدِيمٌ بِلَا إِبْتِدَاء دَائِمٌ بِلَا إِنْتِهَاء. He then spoke about the eternality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He has neither beginning nor does He have any end. And then he explained that statement, وَلَا يَفْنَى وَلَا يَبِيدُ, that He does not perish. He does not perish at all. وَلَا يَكُونُ إِلَّا مَا يُرِيدُ. Okay, then after this, so now we have this opening part covered. Then he went on to explain that the minds and the imagination cannot reach Him, and the understandings of the people cannot grasp Him, and He does not resemble the creatures. So we have now 3 statements in the middle, establishing that it is not possible for anyone to reach the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, neither in the imagination, as in to imagine in the mind, nor in the fahm, in the understanding. Remember, we made the difference between al-wahm and al-fahm. Al-wahm is what goes through your mind, the imagination. Al-fahm is actually an understanding that you acquire. That we explained that in the previous lessons. وَلَا يُشْبِهُ الْأَنَامِ, and He does not resemble any of the creatures. Then he went on to explain that statement with 6 other statements. Right? So the point being here that when you study any text, or when you study any text of creed, then you realize that there's actually a structure, that the one who wrote the creed is not just words, individual sentences that we, if you were to just read it, we would probably think, okay, 1 statement, 2 statement, 3 statement, and we wouldn't really connect anything. But when you go through the explanation, you understand that in fact every sentence and every group of sentences are connected, and there's a structure there, and so it makes it easy for a person to memorize when he understands what is the structure and what is the connection between one statement and the other statement. So this is how you should, when you revise your notes, you should put these statements into blocks. Right? So the first block would naturally be what? The first block is Tawheed, the first 4 statements. We say that Allah is one, إِنَّ اللَّهَ وَاحِدٌ لَا شَرِيكَ لَهُ وَلَا شَيْءَ مِثْلُهُ وَلَا شَيْءَ يُعْجِزُهُ وَلَا إِلَهَ غَيْرُهُ. There's Tawheed for you at the beginning. Then, so you label that Tawheed. At the beginning it's Tawheed. Then he speaks about the eternality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what did he say? He said, قَدِيمٌ بِلَا إِبْتِدَاء دَائِمٌ بِلَا إِنْتِهَاء. Okay? وَلَا يَفْنَى وَلَا يَبِيدُ. Next 3 statements, this is the eternality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And obviously from this also is the eternality of Allah's attributes. His attributes do not have a beginning or an end. If you remember, we discussed that issue as well. That's how you label that bit there. This is the eternality of Allah and His attributes. And then you see, after this, we see وَلَا يَكُونُ إِلَّا مَا يُرِيدُ. Right? This is al-qadr. Just a brief mention of al-qadr here. That these 2 affairs, وَلَا يَكُونُ إِلَّا مَا يُرِيدُ, it covers the whole of al-qadr. So you label this al-qadr. And then the next section, وَلَا تَبْلُغْهُ الْأَوْحَامِ وَلَا تُدْرِكُهُ الْأَفْهَامِ وَلَا يُشْبِهُ الْأَنَامِ. These 3 statements. The imaginations do not grasp Him, cannot reach Him, the understandings cannot grasp Him, and He does not resemble the creatures. All of this now is, you label it as, that Allah can never be fathomed by the human mind, or grasped or pictured in the mind. This is impossible, because Allah does not resemble any of the creatures. Right? So He's introduced that idea at that point. Then the next step, He mentions 6 qualities, or 6 statements, which are an elaboration of that previous one. So in other words, the point I'm making is that when you go through your notes, and when you read through each of these individual statements, what you should do is group them together into subject areas and realize that they're all connected, and realize how each statement explains the previous one. And so when you look at it like this, the whole text becomes very, very easy to remember. It becomes very easy to remember, and it becomes very easy to memorize, and also becomes very easy for you to then explain. Now, if I was to read this now, I want you to explain. First of all, Inna Allaha wahid la sharika lah. What is this? Inna Allaha wahid la sharika lah. Allah is one, there is no partner to Him. This is Tawheed. Tawheed of Allah. The next 3 statements do what? They explain that Tawheed. Uluhiyya, Asma wa Sifat, Ar-Rububiyyah. Wala shay'a yu'jizuhu. It means Allah's Rububiyyah. So in other words, this is how you should structure your notes and group everything together. And as you go through the explanation, you realize that every statement actually is tied to another one. And so in this manner, you find that your comprehension gets better, your understanding gets better, and you understand the text more fully. Because you understand the text more fully. So with that, we conclude today's lesson. And we shall continue in the next lesson, inshallah ta'ala, with the next 4 statements of Imam al-Tahaawi. As we said, خالق بلا حاجة, رازق بلا مؤونة, مميت بلا مخافة, and باعث بلا مشقة. I will continue with them in the next lesson. We conclude today's lesson here. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.